Well, good afternoon to most people out there if you're in the East Coast or getting close on the West Coast. So I'm excited to talk a little bit about discipline restored, a little bit about what I wrote about from hacking school discipline and some of that type of work around there. So excited to share a little bit with you all today. So, the first thing, a little bit of my background, and is my screen still showing up okay? I have a little bit delay on my side. Show my bio? Okay.
Let's see. Yep, it's good. You're good.
All right, thank you. All right, so just a little bit of background on myself. I was a youth worker for 7 years in Lafayette, Indiana. I worked in a residential treatment care center with youth that were either on probation, Department of Child Services placements, but just sort of needed a place to stay. And I worked with them for 7 years, really learned how to embed different ways to hold kids accountable and do it in a way that's like more aligned with their development. Then from there, I became an educator. I was a teacher for a bit, then a college career readiness coordinator, and then I was an assistant principal at a school. And then I moved down from Lafayette, Indiana to Indianapolis, Indiana to help open up Purdue Polytechnic High School. I was one of the founding school administrators as the dean there. It was a school to help out underserved and underprivileged kids. So worked there for a bit. And then after that, I wrote the book, Hacking School Discipline, a little bit about my journey, sort of what I was doing, as well as my co-author at the time, Brad Weinstein, a little bit about his work and what this is. Now what I work on is really helping understand what does belonging look like in schools and ways that discipline systems and practices can make sure that we're amplifying that and repairing harm when harm is caused. Before I do any of my sessions, I always try to make sure that, I'm aligned with everybody and what I want this space to be. I believe that we should always make sure that when we're chatting with one another, that we're in a safe place to learn from each other. So these are just our norms of today's session. Also, with all my sessions, when I'm talking, I like to make sure that we're centered and we're present in the current moment. So if you care to join me in a quick mindfulness exercise, I'd love for you to go ahead and close your eyes if you feel safe doing so. I would like you to picture a place in your head where you feel the most safe and most secure at. This could be a place from your past, present, even something imaginary. Now, in that safe place, I want you to look around. What do you see? What can you notice? Now, in this safe place, I want you to reach your hands out. What can you grab, hold, feel? Think about the sensation on your fingertips. Now let's think about our ears. What are a couple different sounds that you hear in your safe place? What do you notice around you? And then lastly, let's pay attention to our nose. What are a couple different smells that you can smell in your safe place? Go ahead and take a big deep breath in with your nose. Hold it. Longer breath out with your mouth. Thank you. Go ahead and slowly open up your eyes. That was a quick, pleasant imagery activity. Just make sure that we're centered, we're regulated, we're ready to go. And now to sort of, get some questions going. I would love for you to throw this in the chat. But why do you think students act out? What are some of the different reasons why we think students are acting out? Let's throw some of those into the chat, please. So lack of attention at home, attention, overwhelmed. They don't know how to communicate, immaturity, overwhelmed, trauma. They don't know the expectations, confused and scared, attention seeking, problems, a lot of overwhelmed. Thank you. And keep those coming into the chat. There's a lot of different, reasons kids act out in school. And, it's tough to sort of understand the complexities of those different behaviors and how to navigate it. And that's why when you're thinking about strategies and tools, we want to think, as open as possible and then sort of get a little bit more closed-ended as the behavior gets specified. So there's a study done to look at the top 3 reasons why kids are acting out in school. This was done by Psychology Today, and this was the findings up there on the screen. What they found was Some of the top reasons why kids are acting out is power, attention, and unmet needs. Power sometimes comes from power struggles. You know, you have a kid, he has a cell phone out, and you ask them to put it away, and they don't put it away right away. Or maybe it's something more small, like you just start to notice small behaviors around the student, and maybe there's just a little bit of sort of something between that relationship. So that's also another way to sort of look at that power. When we're thinking of that power struggles that come into the classroom, it's really important to make sure that one, when we're dealing with that, we're staying regulated. We're not going to do the pleasant imagery activity when a kid's got their cell phone out in the middle of class, but we do need to make sure that we are regulated so we're open to understanding the relationship and what's taking place. During that time when we're having that conversation with the student and talking to them about this or redirecting that behavior, you also want to make sure that you are allowing their brain to think in a part of more of the reasoning side of their brain, which is that prefrontal cortex. We understand that the prefrontal cortex of the brain helps with sort of like the CEO of the brain with decision makings, knowing what to do, some of those executive functioning type skills. But unfortunately for us, that's the last part of the brain to fully develop. So we have to make sure that we are calming the brain to get that part of the brain to activate, because we also understand that students that may have had trauma or tough lived experiences, sometimes their amygdala, that fight, flight, or freeze response to their brain starts to act really quickly. So when you're thinking about a power struggle that's happened in the past or a student that you've worked with, you want to think about how you navigate that in a way that holds them accountable but doesn't trigger the situation worse. So what I like to do is give the student two options and space to make that decision. By giving a student two options, what you do is you make the decision to behave a little bit smaller with that student, because now they have to understand, do I do this or do I do this? Nothing else. Sometimes we jump really quickly into something like with restorative practices, with an open-ended question during a power struggle, and that just creates complexities, misinformation. So we've got to really slow this down. If the student has their cell phone out in class, we ask them to put it away. The student says, no, I'm talking to my mom, or whatever they may say to us in that time. We say, okay, well, you have two options. One, you could put away the cell phone. We could keep it moving in class, or you keep the cell phone out. And then I'm going to have to decide what comes next. I'm going to give you a minute to make that decision. Okay. And then I walk away from the situation because I understand that that brain, the amygdala and that prefrontal cortex, the amygdala is going to keep going off when I'm around that student, and that prefrontal cortex is not going to get activated. So I give them time and space to make that decision. If they choose not to follow that expectation, that's when I layer in a logical consequence for that behavior, something to really connect the dots for the student. Next one is attention. We understand attention-seeking behavior may come out from a lot of different reasonings. Sometimes it's a lack of a need that's taking place in that student's life. Maybe they're not getting attention at home and they come into school to get that attention. Maybe they're hungry at home and they come into school to, again, get that type of attention, but maybe not from the food. So we have to understand that attention-seeking behavior, we don't want to frame it in a negative way, because we want to seek to understand behind that behavior and understand what's really taking place. And when we're also thinking about students that may be neurodivergent, which could be ADHD or ADD, that's something that I currently have and I've had my whole life. When you think about students that have ADHD like me, that has attention-seeking behavior when I was in school, what would get me to pay attention would be something that evoked curiosity, something that made me think, something that was, unique. So maybe if the teacher wants me to pay attention to a lesson in class and they throw up a little Where's Waldo in one of the presentations, and maybe every time I see that slide and I raise my hand, the teacher knows I'm engaged because I saw that Where's Waldo, and they might reward that type of behavior to help my skill and my focus pay attention to that class. And the last one on there is unmet needs. We understand that unmet needs comes in a lot of different, ways and forms. Sometimes that unmet need is I don't feel like I belong. And that feeling of belonging, we found in the research at my company, High Five, that I do now, is that belonging is this metric that we have to understand for our students in the culture of that classroom. When we understand if a student feels like they belong, they can let us know that need that might be unmet. They can help us walk through and help us navigate conflict better into that classroom. And also, sometimes those students can also identify other students and support each other, because what we need is a connected community in that classroom as much as possible. Thinking about discipline, this is another one that I would love to get some responses in the chat. But when you're thinking about discipline as well, what do you think when you hear the word discipline? What's some of the first things that come to mind? And throw those into the chat, please. consequences, keeping order, guiding, maybe doing something wrong. So there's a lot of different ways to frame non-existent. Sometimes there's a lot of different ways to frame discipline or look at the connotations of the word discipline, like what it truly means. When we're thinking about the root word of discipline, we think of that word as discerna, which is the Latin word that means disciple, to model, to learn, to teach. I believe that in schools, when we're thinking about discipline, if we're not teaching empathy, which is the ability to understand each other's emotions, it's hard to give a student a consequence that's not something that's driving their behavior from fear. So we have to understand that teaching empathy is a complexity. It's something unique. And sometimes students may have that skill developed early on. Sometimes they may not. Dr. Bessel van der Kolk, he talked a lot about the way that the brain develops around trauma too, and that skill of empathy sometimes being suppressed. So when we're thinking about this and discern of that modeling, we have to also think, what are we doing in the classroom to teach that empathy? And the way that I've done this as a past school administrator and educator, youth worker, is teaching through forgiveness. I understand that I make mistakes. We all make mistakes. When students make mistakes in schools, how do they understand how to, forgive each other? How do we forgive the students when they make a mistake for us? And when we do that, we are using that discipline as a modeling tool to teach empathy. And it's really powerful for me, and I hope that you give it a try. But to break that down in 2 steps, and then I want to open it up for some questions for the last 10 minutes, or I can keep going depending on if there is no questions. But a couple ways to look at discipline is 2 different main steps. The first one is to seek to understand behind the behavior. Why is this taking place? What is going on? Did the student throw a pencil because someone kicked the back of their chair? Did the student throw a pencil because they're dysregulated or something triggered them internally, externally? Are they dysregulated because they didn't eat this morning? There's so many different ways to respond. But if we respond in the old school punitive discipline way, which is to use fear to change behaviors, we're hitting sometimes these bumps, which is the trauma and lived experiences of the students, and we start to see more opposition go up. So we want to look at this as not understanding everything, just like that would feel respectful to us. If we showed up late to work and our boss wasn't like, yo, if you show up late one more time, you're gone, they would just ask us what's going on. So we want to make sure we're doing the same thing for our kids. Second way that we use discipline as a teaching tool is we focus on, these 3 steps. The first one is like, what can we do to fix it? I always start small, because if that student may do the same behavior a couple different times, I don't want to say, okay, I did that restorative thing, now I'm going punitive. That's not going to really teach their brain. Their brain's going to understand, if I don't do this restorative thing, then something else may happen, and it's not going to teach them the empathy that we're trying to get. So we want to start small so we can build to teach that empathy and focus on a logical consequence. If a student vandalizes the cafeteria, maybe they should clean up the cafeteria. If a student curses at their friend, maybe they should do an activity with their friend after they've accepted each other's apology. There's different ways to fix it, and that's up to you as the educator. Next one is make sure that we forgive things. I see so many really tough relationships between students and educators sometimes, and I start to dive in a little bit deeper when I'm doing conflict resolution or chatting with them. And sometimes it's something so small that the adult isn't forgiving. And if we're looking at discipline as a modeling tool, the adult has to make sure that they understand forgiveness themselves and ways to teach that. That's not something you need a school administrator or a superintendent or another teacher across the hall or whatever your position may be to tell you to do this. But this is something we have to understand, that with the development of kids, that their brains don't think the same way adults think. They are a lot more, they don't have that prefrontal cortex. So we have to teach them through that forgiveness and understand they have paths to forgiveness when they make a mistake as well. Last one is, we have to be preventative. We have to be, create a plan. We've got to set the students up for success as much as possible around this. And when we're doing this also goes into being proactive, having a relationship, understanding belonging. What does it look like to focus on one another and really building up sort of that connected school community?